Petersen from College of Atlantic, and he brought his own audience with him today, which we appreciate. Chris.
Thanks. Thanks to the group for having me here. I wear a few hats in this county. The one I'm going to be talking about today, although I'm a professor at COA, I'm going to talk about Frenchman Bay Partners quite a bit. And so the creepy little black hand up there is actually Frenchman Bay. So if you look at it, you could actually kind of see where we are. I don't know, I think we're really on the ring finger, I would say, because if you count the Jordan River, which you can't really see, and then the Skillings, and then Taunton, and then over on Sorrento, it's kind of seems to me like a nice little hand that goes there. I'm going to talk, it's going to be a different talk a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about citizen science, and then we'll talk a little bit about the way that we have evolved to try to interact with citizens to do our science. And it's not going to be exactly the same as the citizen science talks that Eric and Seth gave. The people who have been most engaged in this are Jane Disney, which many of you know for all of her eelgrass work, and Jane has done a lot of classic citizen science around here. And Bridie McGreevy, who's at the University of Maine, she's been a graduate student there. She's a social scientist, and she just joined the faculty in communication at the University of Maine, and she works there. Eric was talking about the big grant that involved this, the network from the University of New Hampshire. Both Bridie and I are actually involved in this grant, and some of this work has to do with some of that stuff, so we'll talk about it. What I'm going to try to do in this talk is weave a bunch of threads together. I'm going to start about 2008 and pull a couple threads in. And I've never done this one before. And so we're either going to end up with like a ball of string at the end, or we're going to end up with like some cloth. And so we're kind of hoping for the whole cloth kind of thing. But we don't know. It might be just a very wonderful ball of string at the end. The first piece of string happens in 2008, and it's due to this. And so this is a map from the Frenchman Bay Atlas, which is one of the things we put together that's actually online if you want to go get it. This is the frequency of red tides. And this is from a database that's just about 10 years old, but this is the general pattern, is that red tides are caused by phytoplankton that comes offshore, onshore. And so what happens is in a given year you'll tend to get red tides, you'll get closures down here, but you won't get closures up in the upper parts of bays as much. And in 2008 what happened was the whole state got closed down, except for one little area. Now, one little place was Upper Frenchman Bay. What this meant is that clammers couldn't clam in any of the places were closed. They also couldn't go to any places where towns had ordinances where they actually had restrictions on who could clam there. Gouldsboro actually had an ordinance, so Gouldsboro only could have its own clammers. From Ellsworth through Sullivan and Sorrento, they didn't have an ordinance. And so all you had to do is have a state license to come clamming. And so every clammer in the state came to the Upper Bay and just completely demolished the resource. And so often when we think about when we tend to do environmental work, it often focuses around threats. And then there was a response to this threat by the local clammers. And their response was to go to the state and ask, what can we do? And the state helped them form a regional shellfish committee in 2009. And so there's a 7-town that, Sullivan's part of it, Franklin's part of it, Sorrento, Lemoyne, Hancock, Ellsworth, Trenton are all part of this regional shellfish committee. It's a very difficult committee to run because most towns have individual ordinances, and this was a big regional committee. And this is, so one of the things I'm going to be talking about is our work with this guy. These have 80 commercial clammers who make a reasonable chunk, maybe not all of their money from clamming, and a lot of recreational clammers as well. And so a lot of the work I'm going to talk about is with this group. About the same time in the late 2000s, Jane Disney had begun to work on eelgrass. And a lot of you know about eelgrass here, and you know about its ebb and flow. And if you do, you know in the last couple of years, you haven't really seen very much, right? I mean, in the 90s, eelgrass was fairly abundant. This is just right in Upper Frenchman Bay, right around the Narrows. So this is coming onto MDI, and so this is like Berry Cove, Raccoon Cove, those kinds of areas, Jordan River. A lot of eelgrass. By 2008, it was basically gone. And Jane started doing restoration work in kind of a classic citizen science style, brought out school children to do replanting of eelgrass, did a lot of measurement of eelgrass, got a lot of eelgrass from the Jordan River and was transplanting it to especially places like Hadley Point, but also over in Berry Cove and other places. So Jane's work has just been pretty phenomenal, and it has involved huge numbers of people. And Jane, if you've ever been in the field with her, is a wonderfully just powerful kind of positive presence out there in the field. And so there's a picture of Jane, a lot of the groups that she's worked with. What happened then is pretty soon Jane realized that she couldn't just study natural systems because those natural systems were being influenced by people. And the big concern, and you guys in Taunton Bay have a history of being aware of this, was one of the biggest concerns about eelgrass was whether it was getting dragged by mussel draggers. And so what Jane did, which was really pretty amazing, is she brought together all these groups of people. And they talked about where were places that she was trying to restore eelgrass. And she got them to sign on to a gentleman's agreement not to drag. So it's really, this is not binding, the state doesn't recognize it, but you can see people like Fiona de Koning, who does the mussel, you've seen her boat out there a lot, her and Teo do a commercial operation. A lot of these guys are the various mussel draggers, and Jane and George from Mount Desert Biological Lab. They sat down and they figured out with GIS where the important places were, and they signed off on that. And so what that led Jane to realize is that to do her work, she needed to think more broadly, both ecologically beyond eelgrass, and more broadly in terms of people. And so one of the things she started doing is she pulled together a bunch of people and started holding little, just kind of scoping sessions. We had a scoping session in this room, right over there, about 4 years ago. And I was there, Bob DeForest, who some of you know from Maine Coast Heritage Trust. Helen was there, which was just phenomenal. It was great fun. And we talked about what we thought the threats were, what we thought the patterns were. And after doing a bunch of those scoping sessions, we then, and Seth will recognize this building, we then brought together from UMaine, together with a group that worked with the Nature Conservancy, to do some comprehensive kind of planning. So big comprehensive planning, and we pulled ourselves into a room and we asked, what's the information we have? What are the main threats we're seeing? What are some strategies we can have to do those things? And so some of the people, so there's Fiona laughing at a joke of mine, so I had to throw that in. There's Ann Antonio Blasi, some of you know. I think that's Frank sitting right there, Abe Miller Rushing. And we did all this at CERC over 2 days. So we had a 2-day retreat. And although she had, this is Marcia Brown, who had a tool that was kind of this very complicated pathway where you figured out causes and results and you came up with goals. It was way too complicated. But what it really did is it allowed everybody to turn from looking at each other to focus on that problem and to define that problem. So it became kind of a way to look beyond each other and to look at these potential problems and to think about how to deal with them. That's the way I think about it. I don't know that they think about it that way. But I saw it as more of a tool that allowed us to think together about what those issues were. And we came up with dozens of issues that we were concerned about, shorebirds, islands, various things. But out of those, 4 or 5 really rose to the top. And those, one of the things that came out of that is we decided to form kind of a loose consortium. No fiduciary role, we don't get grants, we kind of decided not to do that early. Anybody can be a partner, Friends of Taunton Bay is a partner. Lots of groups of partners, individuals can become partners. And this is our very, very broad mission statement. And one of the things it has is that we're concerned not only ecologically, but also economically and socially. And we'll see how that plays out when we start talking about clamors. Out of that really retreat, 4 or 5 areas came out. Obviously, eelgrass was going to come out. Jane was there. I mean, there's no way eelgrass was not going to come out as a main concern in that area. But other ones came out. Working waterfront, and this place is another great example of that, where Gordon's Wharf is now new working waterfront that's now being used. But working waterfront is disappearing from Maine, and we're really concerned about people being able to make their living on the water, and so we're spending a lot of time trying to do that. Migratory fish are a main concern. Again, in Sullivan, the work that Gary Edwards has done on Flanders Stream is just phenomenal getting that back up. And we've been looking at other streams like Jones Stream in Gouldsboro. Morancy Stream is another one that we think has a lot of potential for work. I do a lot of work in the Somes-Minell Sanctuary. In fact, tomorrow morning, I'm taking many of these students out to go get those fish ladders all set up, because the alewives are probably running, and up in Franklin you could probably see the youngs are probably already collecting alewives up on the stream, up on Grist Mill Stream. And also benthic habitat came up as a main one, which has been a little bit harder to work on. It's subtidal, it's deeper, but there's been some work done there. So those are some of the things we've been engaged in.
You're talking about threats to benthic habitat?
We're talking about, all of this involves, Steve, all of this involves threats, what we think the problems are, what we think the restoration elements are.
What is the problem with benthic habitat?
The problem with benthic habitats, where people, there's clearly in our early stuff, the biggest concern that always came up was dragging. Dragging always came up as a major concern. It turns out that dragging really depends a lot on what kind of habitat you're in. If you're in a really rocky habitat, or in a really muddy habitat, both of those can create problems. In sandy habitats, it's not nearly as big a problem. And so we're trying to, and part of that was also looking historically, looking through historical records. So some of the work we've done is we've actually gone out on schooners trying to do tub trawling, kind of old, we tried to replicate some tub trawling from the 1860s with some people, some going to the old traditional fishing sites. So Charlie Ray and I and Brian Tarbox from Southern Maine Community College have done that. So we've been trying to assess some stuff. And frankly, DMR has some data on what kind of habitats are good, and the maps aren't really very updated and very real. And then intertidal mudflats is another one. Many of these habitats have both, or many of these ideas, and the habitats are really these four, many of these have both reasons to think they could be in trouble ecologically, but also social and economic kind of benefits. And so they often involve stakeholders that are making their livings on these places. And then we ended up forming an executive committee. And so this is the current Frenchman Bay Partners Executive Committee. I happen to be Vice President, Jane's President. Bridie, who I've mentioned before, is there. Thank you. Right.
Not very good.
That picture is not very good. Fiona, so we actually have a harvester, is on our executive committee, and Bob DeForest, who many of you know from Maine Coast Heritage Trust, who I think used to have an office right over there until about a few months ago. Okay, and now he's back in Somesville with Maine Coast Heritage Trust. They've changed that office. Part of what we do is very traditional citizen science. These are our students going out doing clam surveys to try to assess just densities of clams and clam flats. And this is actually something that the state requires any town that has an ordinance to do. Part of what you have to do is you have to keep track of that data. But this is a picture of Bridie, and you notice Bridie is not getting muddy, because what Bridie is, she's a communications major, and what she's doing is she's talking to one of the clammers. And so we also try to get the commercial clammers out with us. And so that's Richard Taylor, who has the initials RAT. So if you've ever come onto the island and see rats and clams to sell, that's his sign, and so it's Rat's sign, and so he's known affectionately as Rat by most people. And so Rat, David Dutton, who's another reclaimant, Joshua Hodgkins, and they've worked. It's been really fun to take them out there. But part of what we were interested in doing, and I'll try to start developing a little bit, is that the science that we're doing is we're not necessarily always bringing citizen science projects to them. Is that instead, Bridie's model, where she comes from, is what they call at the University of Maine sustainability science. And it's much more problem solving directed. And it's about, first of all, responding to needs of local communities, both environmental and economic, and then being collaborative with those people. And so we don't necessarily come to a community with a citizen science project we come to a group and we kind of say, what kind of science are you interested in doing, or what are the questions that you have? It's much harder work, it's a pain. But we'll go into a couple of examples. And so back to the Regional Shellfish Committee. The Regional Shellfish Committee is made up of a bunch of clammers that now have to communicate effectively with 7 towns, to collect data, organize meetings and run meetings, open and close clam flats, have some kind of democratic process. This is all really hard stuff to do. And they just want a clam. And so they came to us with this as a potential issue and asked us what kinds of things could we do to help them. And so some of the things we did, this is a slide I stole from Jane, so it has a lot of pictures of me in it. I tried to put pictures of Jane and Bridie in mine. We went out and we taught them how to do surveys. And so this was, I think, at Raccoon Cove in Lemoyne about 3 years ago. And we'd go out and we were just teaching them how the state does stuff so they could learn to figure out how to do it themselves. Really straightforward, but it was a lot of fun. I mean, this is Jim Norris, who's a great guy, just been wonderful to work with. You know Jim, he's just an amazingly great person. And then another thing we did with this group is one of the very early problems that they had was they were pretty mad at the mussel draggers in the clam flats because they felt that the mussel draggers were coming in and they were dragging over their clam flats and removing some of their best mud flats. They were a little worried about the wormers coming in and digging up their clam flats. And so what we did is we facilitated a meeting between the clammers, the wormers, the mussel draggers, and also people like, that's Hannah Annis, who's Maine Department of Marine Resources, but it wasn't her meeting. She was one of the stakeholders that came to that meeting. And what we did is we sat down with maps and we kind of said, what are the areas that are important to you? We actually had somebody doing a live real-time GIS mapping. And we kind of came to an agreement of where the important places were and where they weren't. And so what we did is we tried to, so like Joe Parrott is there. Some of you guys know Joe, does a lot of work around here. Ralph Smith, some other people in these pictures. And these guys got together and came at the end and were a lot closer to understanding what the concerns were and what places were good for dragging, what places they were going to leave alone for a while, and came to a really nice understanding. Now this was brought about in part because the state had just given clam committees the authority to close down some flats to mussel draggers. And that brought the mussel draggers to the table. It did, you know, just what happened. But then once they got there, it was actually really cordial. And one of the things that comes up time and time again when I work with these stakeholders, when I work with these commercial harvesters, is they'll just fill the room with expletives, and then when they're talking about somebody else, and then they'll say at the end, but I wouldn't want him not to be able to make a living. And so there's always this, at the end, there's always this concession that I would like to see some change, but I don't want to, keep this guy from being able to make $1 at the end of the day. And that's kind of one of the themes that keeps on coming up, that kind of pulls these people together and gets them to talk about stuff. The group has had this regional shellfish committee has had 2 major kind of challenges. One is a social political challenge, running meetings and communicating with its members. Their first few meetings were wonderful. It was like going to the Thirsty Well in the 90s. It was just a good time, and people would scream at each other and then they'd leave and then they'd come back in again, but they always came back into the room because those were the decisions were being made. There also were environmental issues. Clam flats, some clam flats the clams were disappearing. Some places they were having other kinds of issues, and they were worried about pH, they were worried about green crabs. And so there were a lot of concerns. And so one of the things we did is we worked with them collaboratively to do grant writing, because they really didn't have a lot of capacity for grant writing. So we wrote grants from them. We got, I think, a $7,500 grant the first year from the Maine Community Foundation. And what that grant was to do, it's called the 610 Project, because unfortunately there's 610 closed acres in Upper Frenchman Bay to clamming. So there's 610 closed acres of mud flats. And one thing we could all agree on, that getting the pollution out of those mud flats and getting them open would be a good thing. It would be a good thing environmentally, it would be a good thing economically for them to be able to do that. And so a lot of our work has been trying to organize that kind of capacity. And then we also just wanted to build capacity in the committee in terms of their ability to communicate. And so this has all been done collaboratively with the group. We helped them do things like, actually one of the clammers helped develop a website, and so they have better communication. They actually have a Facebook page. It's pretty fun to watch these guys do stuff. Then we also brought together an advisory group, and the advisory group included people from the Department of Marine Resources. It included shell fishermen like Joe and Jim, and included people like Jane and Bridie and me to all sit down at a table together and to talk about how we were going to spend money, what were the main priorities, what clam flats were the most important. DMR is totally overbooked with work. These guys are amazing how much work they do. And so when you ask, they have to figure out where to set their priorities in terms of what try the clam flats to get open. And that's going to depend on how easy the clam flat is to get open. But if they open one that doesn't have any clams in it, it's pretty worthless. And so the clammers were giving them priorities of places where they could focus their energy. And so just that increased communication between DMR and the clammers was really, really important. So these are just some maps of clam maps. This is on the Skillings River. This is Kilkenny Cove, which comes out of the tannery, the old tannery, so there's lots of nice chromium in here. But it turns out that this part has now gotten pretty cleaned up, and this much of the cove is about to open up. And the DMR and EPA have been really collaborative with us on that, and that's really good. Martin and Weir Cove, we're still trying to find some of the sources of pollution there. Here's Taunton Bay. This little spot right here, that's where the Youngs, I think, have their little their weir where they collect alewives. That's probably about to open. That's cleaned up quite a bit. You can see though that there's other places, Egypt and Hog Bay and some other spots that are not doing as well. But then, so we were actually having some luck getting some of these areas closed up. But at the same time, it's a little hard to see. This is the causeway, and so this is Trenton, and this is the airport right here. And this is a closed area. We thought this was about to get open, and then a month later, we found out that it's actually going to get closed further because there's a new pollution source. And so one of the things we've learned from this is we were remarkably naive. That we thought like we'd start with 610 and we keep shrinking and getting it down to 0. But really what we're doing is we're playing a game of whack-a-mole. So what we're doing is we're opening some up, and every time we open one or two up, a new one pops up and gets closed. And so it's a very dynamic system, right? The world's a dynamic place. And so what we're doing is we're closing some areas, and then other areas are coming up as problematic, so we're constantly on the move. I think this is a lifetime bit of work we could do on this one. So we've had some successes. We've opened up some clam flats. We've clearly increased town and state communication, which was a real problem. We've helped them prioritize places. We've helped them with their group process quite a bit. Hi, Dwayne. Then we came back the next year, because these Maine Community Foundation grants are every year. And we've been doing water quality work, it's working well. We can apply for some more money, we still have some left. Should we go for some more water quality work? And this was in 2013. And if you remember 2013, what happened in 2013 is there were green crabs everywhere. And all the small clams that were existing were getting eaten up. And what they said was, we want to kill green crabs. That was what they told us. And even though our grant was more water quality related, what we did is we said, okay. And so we wrote a $5,000 Maine Community Foundation grant that was mostly for crab traps. It's the most unique grant I've ever written. It's like $5,000, $4,000 crab traps, and we got it. And so what we're doing now is we now had a green crab eradication program to kind of start up. It's a completely different program. And we would have never done this. This wouldn't have been ours, but this is because what we're actually trying to do is not bring citizen science projects to them. We're trying to teach them how to be scientists and how to do work. So it's a different way of thinking about citizen science. What we'd really like them to do, my goal, is when they get on a clam flat, is not to know the answer, but to ask the questions. So we've caught some green crabs, but a really interesting thing happened last summer. The winter, not this winter, but the winter before, was actually a fairly cold winter. And the 2 winters before were warm, and that was thought to really increase green crabs. Last winter, hardly any green crabs came up until later in the season. I don't know if you guys noticed, but it wasn't until about August that they really rolled in. And the price of clams was about $2.80, $2.90 a pound. And so, you know, our clammers are, you know, rational actors in this economy. And so what did they do? We got them all these traps and we go, okay, we have this design of the study. And they went, yeah, no, I'm going to go catch clams because the crabs aren't in and the clams are really a good price. And so they like pretty much abandoned the study and went out and went clamming and made a lot of money, which is exactly what they should be doing. But it's like, so we take a step forward, we're designing studies with them and sometimes they work and sometimes the unexpected happens. And in fact, what we're learning is that the unexpected happens a lot. This year, I think it's been a pretty cold winter. I expect green crabs maybe not to be a big problem, but we're going to keep on working and learning how to do stuff. Meanwhile, Jane's been doing much more traditional citizen science with her groups. This is mostly the work I'm talking about is Bridie and my work with individuals. Jane's been working with school groups in a much more kind of directed way. And Jane actually also got green crab traps because she was worried about that they were the main cause of her eelgrass problems. And Jane was actually going out there and collecting data. One of the interesting things about Jane's data set is that she was trying to figure out if places that had a lot of loss of eelgrass had a lot more green crabs. And the core, it looks like a shotgun hit the board, basically. There's no pattern whatsoever in her data set. Although it's a very small, it's a 410 shotgun. It's not 12 gauge. It's just a few pellets, and so there's no real pattern right now that we can see between green crabs and loss of eelgrass. Although in some places it clearly has been documented that they're a potential problem with this. They're also a potential problem with our clams. Last year was not a big year for green crabs, and we actually did do some work. And so Jim Norris has been just a godsend. Jim is amazing how much work he does with us and how much time he puts away stuff. But Jim at one point last season had to stop working with us. And it was just amazing because he said, well, the reason is because clammers kind of fall into 2 categories, the ones that have boats and the ones that don't. And if you have a boat, you're like a high-class clammer because you can go to a bunch of extra clam flats. And there were a few guys who were struggling financially, and so he just stopped working with us for a few weeks because he was taking those guys out to do stuff. It was great. I love this guy. But then what happened was, without the green crabs, if you looked on a clam flat last fall, it was covered with tiny dots because we had amazingly good recruitment of clams, and the clams didn't all get killed. There were quite a few that did get killed. But if you looked at, like in Berry Cove, on an average little couple-inch plot, we were getting these huge numbers of little clams. I mean, it was kind of disgusting and hard to count, frankly. And it was, Tyler shaking his head, yeah. Because it was. I mean, it was pretty amazing. And there was a lot of mortality. You could go up to the tide line and pick up your hand and get a lot of dead clamshells, but there were still a lot that were doing quite well. And so when we talked to our clammers in late winter kind of thing, said, well, what do you want to do this year? They were really clear. They said, we don't have a lot of adult clams. We have a lot of baby clams. We want to figure out how to protect them. And so the experiment we've designed for this year is about trying to figure out what the predators are if they're really green crabs. And so we're putting out netting. And originally, the first netting experiment setup was scheduled for April 12th. Joe Parada called me 4 days before and says the intertidal's frozen, we can't do it. And so that's scheduled for about 3 weeks from now. We're going to be out in mid-May with them, setting up an experiment. So we're going to, at the same time we're doing this kind of, so we're going to try to look, we're going to assess predators, but we're also going to try to see if we can really figure out what the role of this is, and if something like netting can actually help reduce that problem. And so, you know, we're there and working with the design forum and giving them stuff, but we're really kind of feeding off their ideas and they're feeding off ours. An example of this is last fall. They were Berry Cove, which is over in Lemoyne. In Berry Cove, they were, I think that's still Lemoyne, yeah. In Berry Cove, there were some local landowners that wanted to be able to just do local clamming, and all the clam flat was closed out in front of Berry Cove. And so the clam committee said, well, we'll go do a survey and see what it's like over there. And so they did a survey, and when they did that survey, that was this survey, we found that there were hardly any adult clams. And so we were out there together with the clammers, and they said, well, we can't really open this. But they were feeling really bad for the local kind of people in that cove, and so they kept on working. And so we were originally doing this, and then they said, well, let's keep on going over to this rocky area. And they went over to the rocky area, found pretty reasonable adult densities, and said, well, what happens if we make the closure end right here? Because right now it continues on. We can open up an area where these people can come down to the beach and come over and do clamming, but we'll still keep this area with all the young ones that we really like closed. And so this is actually my students' report. This is just a little screenshot from the students' report. The students came back to the Shellfish Committee. They recommended that. They approved it. The state approved it. And so now we kind of have both of these things going on at the same time. So this is different than coming in with a project and getting data. It's it's this. So clammers, students, happy professor. And so that's what we try to do with these guys. And I'm going to shill for a second. The last thing I just want to let you know is that at this time next Saturday, so a week from today, at College of the Atlantic, we're going to have our annual Frenchman Bay Partners meeting. Anybody's welcome to come. We're going to talk about all of those threats. We'll talk a little bit about mudflats, a little bit about eelgrass, some about diadromous fish. We're also bringing in Sean Smith, who does stream work. Seth mentioned the Wild Acadia project, and so I'm actually involved in Cromwell. My students are doing, I think, 2 of the 6 sites. So to get back to what Steve was bringing up, we're actually doing several sites along Cromwell and Keebo Brook, both above and below the golf course, above and below Cerdamont, below the town. We actually have one at Tideline as well. And this is one of the many places where we get feedback from stakeholders on what kind of work they're interested in having us do. And so that's what we try to do. And at that, I'll stop and take a question, and then we can lunch. Okay, so thank you.